Hi everyone, this is your short video lecture on social contract theory. So social contract theory is the idea that states are made legitimate and justice is secured via either the implicit or explicit agreement of the citizens of the country or the state. Okay. And so the idea with social contract theory is that when we enter into a society, what we're doing is we're agreeing to be bound by a set of rules, right? Typically, these are laws, all right? But even more fundamentally, we're agreeing upon a certain conception of justice. And again, it's going to entail how it is we distribute the benefits and burdens of society. And we're also agreeing to how it is we ought to be governed, okay? So in a fundamental way, it's not just laws, although laws are important in terms of political philosophy, but further, what system of government are we going to have? And the idea is that that system of government is legitimized when the citizens of that state agree to it, okay? Now, this might almost kind of sound like, oh, it's kind of like a kind of democracy, right? So the citizens are agreeing to be governed in a certain kind of way. It's not just kind of like a democracy. Not quite. You can have societies that are very autocratic, or another way of putting it, it can be run by a single person or single entity, say. It could be run by a small group of people. It could be like an aristocracy. It could be a meritocracy. It could be a democracy. It could be several different kinds of government. It just matters that the people living under it either implicitly or explicitly agree to be ruled by that party, okay? And the idea with the implicit or explicit agreement, which we'll get into a little bit later, but in general, the idea is that when you are in a society, you're implicitly agreeing that you're okay with the form of governance that is being executed in that state, okay? Just by the mere fact you're living in it. Because if you didn't agree to it, why would you be living there, is the idea at least. So that's the idea behind social contract theory. Now there's two social contract theories we're looking at primarily. One is Thomas Hobbes and the other is John Locke. You might have heard of both of these people. And in particular, John Locke is actually very influential in how it is the United States got started. So the founding fathers took a lot of inspiration from John Locke. John Locke, and in particular political philosophy in general, there's lots of cases where you have philosophers having really profound impact on the world. And in particular, again, John Locke has a pretty profound impact in how it is we govern things in the United States and across the world, kind of consequently. So anyway, so we're looking at Hobbes and Locke really briefly here. Now, in social contract theory, there's usually like a story that you're going to tell about how a society was formed, okay? And based upon that story is told, you're going to get a sense of how it is government should be run, all right? And there's this thing called the state of nature. And the state of nature is how things were prior to any sort of civilizations or society. So when we're out in the wild and there's no sort of official states or countries or anything like that, how is our lives going, okay? That's what the state of nature is like. And Hobbes and Locke have different ideas of how the state of nature was. So Hobbes thought the state of nature was bad. You might have heard the quote that's attributed to Hobbes, where he says that life in the state of nature is short, nasty, and brutish. That's what he thinks the state of nature is like. So he thinks that when you're out in the wild and there's no societies, that everyone's really out for themselves, everyone's really egotistical, everyone's pretty immoral, everybody is pretty vicious, no one's really cooperating, and you're gonna die early, right? It's not a really pleasant life at all, okay? That's how Hobbes thinks of things. Consequently, so suppose that's how the state of nature actually was, and there's some debate whether or not that's correct. Maybe it is, maybe it isn't. But suppose it is correct, and you lived in that state of nature. You might think, man, all right, well, I'm up to have a really bad life. Is there any way that I can fix that? Well, yes there is, Hobbes thinks. The way you fix that is you enter into a social contract. And in particular, you try to form a certain kind of society. And Hobbes is going to say that the certain kind of society that you'll want to get into because of that state of nature is a society that is designed to keep peace and enforce agreements, right? So if you suppose you didn't live in a society, okay, and you wanted to loan someone $100 and you're like, you gonna promise me you're gonna pay this back? And they're like, oh yeah, I'll pay you back, whatever. Okay, suppose they don't, all right? well, what are you going to do now, right? So there's no really legal recourse because you're not in society, right? You can't just be like, oh, I'm going to take you to small claims court for $100. Or maybe they'll get $1,000 to make it more plausible, whatever. Okay, so there's no legal system you can fall back on. What are you going to do? You can try to get it yourself. What if they're stronger than you? Well, then you're just out like a bunch of money, okay? It just got stolen from you. And you might die as a result, okay? The idea is, so basically the idea is just that it's really hard to enforce contracts outside of society. So contracts, right, it could just be like lending money, it could be, think of like leases on apartments, or like when you sign a car, or even when you use things on your phone, you're signing a kind of contract. Typically with apps, you're signing a kind of contract. Those are all enforceable because we have systems in place in society to enforce those things. That's really important. Like a really fundamental point in society is enforcing contracts. And so Hobbes is going to say, well, the one thing you want to do, okay, so you're living this short, brutish, nasty life. Okay, first thing you want to do, make sure people are following their agreements. Okay, we got to be able to enforce contracts. So we're going to have a government that's going to let you do that. And we also want to keep the peace too, right? We want to do it in a kind of way that makes sure that people aren't out hurting one another, right? And they're not just out for themselves. Okay. Now, how are you going to do that effectively? Well, Hobbes is going to say the way you do that effectively, the way you get these goals, is when you enter into that social contract, when you enter society, Hobbes is going to say how things should be is you're going to give up some of your rights. Okay, so he thinks that the rights that we have, are, and not just legal rights, we're just talking about like moral rights here too. We're not just talking about legalities. So he thinks that you're going to be giving up some of your rights in exchange for security. Okay, and what rights you give up is going to vary dependent upon the sort of situations you find yourself in. But in general, the idea is that the main head of the government in Hobbes's ideal form of government is a absolute sovereign. They're a kind of monarch. They have absolute power, and their goal is to keep the peace, and their goal is to make sure that people abide by their contracts, and it'll do whatever it takes to get these two things going. Okay, that might mean restricting your freedoms in profound ways. It might mean relaxing those restrictions. It's going to kind of depend, okay? So for example, if you decide not to, suppose you sign into a contract with me and I loan you $1,000, you don't pay it back. In Hobbes society, you just gave up the right to live wherever you want because, for instance, because you'll be in jail, right? So they might just jail you, for instance. Some crimes may be given up to your right to your life, right? And you might be killed as a result, all right? Or whatever, all right? There might be restrictions on freedom of speech. If you think freedom of speech is a kind of moral right that you have and not just a legal right, okay? In any event, so the sovereign is this absolute kind of person, and they have complete control over the government. It's a kind of monarchy, all right? So it's not a democracy at all, okay? Now there's a worry with Hobbes' form of government typically when people hear that they're gonna think, oh my gosh, isn't the sovereign just gonna like be a complete tyrant and take away everybody's rights and just make everyone miserable? If the tyrant does do that, or excuse me, not the tyrant, the the tyrant in this case, I should say. But if the absolute sovereign does do that, Hobbes thinks that it's legitimate for the people in that society to engage in revolution, overthrow that person. Okay, so it's totally legitimate, he thinks. When governments, this is true of Locke too, once we get to that, when governments stop fulfilling their role, and for Hobbes the role again is enforcing contracts and keeping the peace. If they're not doing either of those things, then it's an illegitimate government. People do not agree to this when they enter into the social contract, and as a result, they can try to overthrow the government if they like, and it's completely morally permissible to do so. Okay. Now, if the government is doing both those things, then people have no claim to overthrow the government. Okay. That's a really sort of crucial point. Okay, so quick recap on Hobbes. So the state of nature is bad. What's the point of society is to keep peace and enforce contracts. You have an absolute sovereign to do that. If the absolute sovereign decides not to do those two things, then people can legitimately overthrow the sovereign. And your rights, again, these are your moral rights here, not just your legal rights. Those are contingent upon the sovereign, basically, and what the sovereign's going to be deeming fit in pursuit of these two goals. Okay, so that's what Hobbes thinks. Now Locke's different. So Locke thinks the state of nature is mostly good. So he thinks in general people are pretty decent. He thinks that people follow what's called the natural moral law. So he thinks that a lot of people have a kind of natural moral inclination, like a basic kind of natural moral inclination. We're not all just selfish and out for one another, although we might be to some degree. We're kind of a little nicer than in Hobbes' picture. Things could be better though, okay? But it's pretty okay. But they could be better, according to Locke, all right? Now, how could it be better? Well, for one, again, there might be a worry of security, okay? So when you don't live in a society, security and a sense of safety might be a top priority for you, because if you're out in the wild, then who knows who's going to attack you, okay? What's going to attack you? Or you're going to shelter and whatever, all right? So one part of society is to keep the peace and to keep people safe. It's also to enforce the public good. And what the public good is a really complicated question, okay? But the idea for Locke, at least, is, so Locke's a lot more sympathetic to democratic forms of government. That's how we sort of got our kind of government here, because again, as I said earlier, Locke had a lot of influence upon American government. But anyway, the public good can mean lots of things. The idea in general is just that the government's there to make sure that people's rights are respected. Excuse me. And what's really different between Locke and Hobbes, so Hobbes is going to say your rights are contingent upon the sovereign. Locke is going to say that, no, you have certain rights. You have certain inalienable rights. That might ring some bells for some of you, right? This idea of inalienable rights that comes from the Constitution, that comes from Locke, right? He thinks that you have some rights that no matter what, they can never be violated legitimately, okay? Mostly, okay, there's some exceptions, but mostly you are just born having certain kind of moral rights, and no one can take those away from you no matter what, all right? Again, for the most part. One of those rights he thinks is a right to property. You get that just by being alive and being a human, okay? So property rights is something that's really important for Locke. You have freedom of religion too, that's another really important right for Locke, and some other ones too, but we don't need to get into all the details of that. So anyway, so you have some rights that you're born with, and they're inalienable, they cannot be violated unless it's a very particular kind of circumstance. So your right to property could be violated if, for instance, you do something to put everyone else in harm's way with your property. So for instance, if you decide to bring a bomb to a movie theater, the bomb's your property, but your bomb can be confiscated because you're putting other people in harm's way. Okay, so that's a case where your right to property can be violated, but besides cases like those, you can't really have your property rights violated. Okay, so that's what Locke is going to say about rights. So government, for both these philosophers, does have a function to try to keep the peace and enforce contracts to an extent. For Locke, it's the case as well, but it's not really emphasized as much. The main difference really between these two is how the state of nature is, and then consequently how you want your government to be, right? So Hobbes is really concerned about like security here, you might think. And for Locke, it's a little bit different. For Locke, it's primarily concerned with making sure people's rights are upheld and respected. Okay. So that's a sort of really brief overview of both John Locke and Thomas Hobbes. The next video is going to be on feminist critiques of these more classical ideas of justice.